You are listening to Dracula, Part 1 by Bram Stoker. Dracula by Bram Stoker, illustration, Colophon, New York, Grosset and Dunlap Publishers. Copyright 1897 in the United States of America, according to Act of Congress, by Bram Stoker, all rights reserved. Printed in the United States at the Country Life Press, Garden City, NY. To my dear friend Hamibeg, contents Chapter 1, Jonathan Harker's Journal. Chapter 2, Jonathan Harker's Journal, Chapter 3, Jonathan Harker's Journal, Chapter 4, Jonathan Harker's Journal, Chapter 5, Letters, Lucy and Mina, Chapter 6 and 6, Mina Murray's Journal, Chapter 6, 7, Cutting from the Daily Graph, 8 August, Chapter 6, Mina Murray's Journal, Chapter 7, Mina Murray's Journal, Chapter 6, Mina Murray's Journal, Chapter 6, Lucy, Weston Ross Diary, Chapter 3, Dr. Seward's Diary, Chapter 13, Dr. Seward's Diary. Chapter 6, Mina Harker's Journal. Chapter 6, Dr. Seward's Diary. 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 Chapter 9, Jonathan Harker's Journal, Chapter 6, Jonathan Harker's Journal, Chapter 6, Dr. Seward's Diary, Chapter 6, Jonathan Harker's Journal, Chapter 6, Dr. Seward's Diary, Chapter 6, Dr. Seward's Phonograph Diary, spoken by Van Helsing. Dr. Seward's Diary, Chapter 26 Scenes. Dr. Seward's Diary, Chapter 26 Scenes. Mina Harker's Journal. How these papers have been placed in sequence will be made manifest in the reading of them. All needless matters have been eliminated so that a history almost at variance with the possibilities of later-day belief may stand forth as simple fact. This passage serves as the introductory material to Dracula by Bram Stoker, published in 1897. It includes the copyright information, a dedication to a friend named Hamibeg, and a table of contents listing the chapters, which are primarily composed of journal entries, letters, and diaries from characters such as Jonathan Harker, Mina Murray, Lucy Westenra, and Dr. Seward. A note explains that the compiled papers have been carefully sequenced and stripped of irrelevant details to present a coherent history that challenges modern disbelief, framing the narrative as a factual account. There is throughout no statement of past things wherein memory may err, for all the records chosen are exactly contemporary, given from the standpoints and within the range of knowledge of those who made them. Dracula, Chapter 1, Jonathan Harker's Journal, kept in shorthand, 3 May Bistritz. Left Munich at 8:35 p.m. On 1st May, arriving at Vienna early next morning, should have arrived at 6:46, but train was an hour late. Budapest seems a wonderful place, from the glimpse which I got of it from the train and the little I could walk through the streets. I feared to go very far from the station, as we had arrived late and would start as near the correct time as possible. The impression I had was that we were leaving the west and entering the east, the most western of splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of noble width and depth, took us among the traditions of Turkish rule. In this passage from Dracula, Jonathan Harker begins his journal on May 3rd in Bistritz, documenting his journey that started on May 1st from Munich. He describes a delayed train arrival in Vienna and a brief, captivating glimpse of Budapest, noting the city's blend of Western and Eastern influences as he crosses a grand bridge over the Danube. Harker expresses a cautious approach to exploring, staying close to the station due to the late arrival and impending departure. We left in pretty good time and came after nightfall to Klausenburg. Here I stopped for the night at the Hotel Royal. I had for dinner, or rather supper, a chicken done up some way with red pepper, which was very good but thirsty. Mem, get recipe for Mina. I asked the waiter, and he said it was called paprika Hendel, and that, as it was a national dish, I should be able to get it anywhere along the Carpathians. I found my smattering of German very useful here. Indeed, I don't know how I should be able to get on without it. Having had some time at my disposal when in London, I had visited the British Museum and made search among the books and maps in the library regarding Transylvania. It had struck me that some foreknowledge of the country could hardly fail to have some importance in dealing with a nobleman of that country. I find that the district he named is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of 3 states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. I was not able to light on any map or work giving the exact locality of the Castle Dracula, as there are no maps of this country as yet to compare with our own Ordnance Survey maps, but I found that Bistritz, the post town named by Count Dracula, is a fairly well-known place. I shall enter here some of my notes, as they may refresh my memory when I talk over my travels with Mina. In the population of Transylvania, there are 4 distinct nationalities: Saxons in the south, and mixed with them the Wallachs, who are the descendants of the Dacians, Magyars in the west, and Seculis in the east and north. I am going among the latter, who claim to be descended from Attila and the Huns. This may be so, for when the Magyars conquered the country in the 11th century, they found the Huns settled in it. I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some sort of imaginative whirlpool. If so, my stay may be very interesting, ma'am. I must ask the Count all about. The narrator, unable to find precise maps of the region surrounding Castle Dracula, identifies Bistritz as a notable nearby town mentioned by Count Dracula. While preparing notes for future discussions with Mina, the narrator describes Transylvania's diverse population, including Saxons, Wallachs, Magyars, and Seculis, the latter of whom claim descent from Attila and the Huns, and reside in the area the narrator is visiting. The region, particularly the Carpathian Mountains, is noted as a hub of global superstitions, sparking the narrator's curiosity to learn more from the Count. About them, I did not sleep. Well, though my bed was comfortable enough, for I had all sorts of queer dreams. There was a dog howling all night under my window, which may have had something to do with it, or it may have been the paprika, for I had to drink up all the water in my carafe, and was still thirsty. Towards morning I slept and was wakened by the continuous knocking at my door, so I guess I must have been sleeping soundly then. I had for breakfast more paprika and a sort of porridge of maize flour, which they said was mammaliga, and eggplant stuffed with forcemeat, a very excellent dish which they call implatata. Mem, get recipe for this also. I had to hurry breakfast, for the train started a little before 8, or rather it ought to have done so, for after rushing to the station at 7:30, I had to sit in the carriage for more than an hour before we began to move. It seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are. In this passage, the narrator describes a restless night filled with strange dreams, possibly due to a howling dog or the spicy paprika from dinner, which left them thirsty despite drinking all their water. They awoke to persistent knocking, had a breakfast of local dishes including paprika, mamaliga, and implatata, and noted a desire to obtain the recipe for the latter. Rushing to catch a train scheduled before 8, they arrived at 7:30, only to wait over an hour before departure. Observing that train punctuality seems to worsen the further east one travels. are the trains. What ought they to be in China? All day long we seemed to dawdle through a country which was full of beauty of every kind. Sometimes we saw little towns or castles on the top of steep hills such as we see in old missals. Sometimes we ran by rivers and streams which seemed from the wide stony margin on each side of them to be subject to great floods. It takes a lot of water and running strong to sweep the outside edge of a river clear. At every station there were groups of people, sometimes crowds, and in all sorts of attire. Some of them were just like the peasants at home, or those I saw coming through France and Germany, with short jackets and round hats and homemade trousers, but others were very picturesque. The women looked pretty, except when you got near them, but they were very clumsy about the waist. They had all full white sleeves of some kind or other, and most of them had big belts with a lot of strips of something fluttering from them like the dresses in a bag. Throughout the day, the narrator travels through a visually stunning countryside, passing by charming towns and castles perched on steep hills, as well as rivers with wide stony banks indicating frequent flooding. At each train station, they observe diverse groups of people dressed in varied attire, ranging from familiar peasant clothing similar to those seen in France and Germany to more striking, picturesque outfits. The women, though appearing pretty from a distance, are noted for their clumsy waistlines and wear dresses with full white sleeves, large belts adorned with fluttering strips, reminiscent of ballet costumes, yet layered over petticoats. Ballet, but of course there were petticoats under them. The strangest figures we saw were the Slovaks, who were more barbarian than the rest, with their big cowboy hats, great baggy, dirty white trousers, white linen shirts, and enormous heavy leather belts, nearly a foot wide, all studded over with brass nails. They wore high boots with their trousers tucked into them, and had long black hair and heavy black mustaches. They are very picturesque, but do not look prepossessing. On the stage they would be set down at once as some old oriental band of brigands. They are, however, I am told, very harmless and rather wanting in natural self-assertion. It was on the dark side of twilight when we got to Bistritz, which is a very interesting old place, being practically on the frontier, for the Borgo Pass leads from it into Bukovina. It has had a very stormy existence, and it certainly shows marks of it. 50 years ago, a series of great fires took place, which made the passage describes the Slovaks, a group of people who stand out due to their distinctive and rugged appearance, dressed in cowboy hats, baggy trousers, linen shirts, and wide leather belts studded with brass nails, complemented by high boots, long black hair, and heavy mustaches. Despite their intimidating brigand-like look, they are noted to be harmless and lacking in self-assertion. The narrative also mentions arriving at Bistritz, an old and historically turbulent town on the frontier near the Borgo Pass, bearing the scars of a stormy past, including devastating fires that struck 50 years prior on 5 separate occasions. Terrible havoc on 5 separate occasions. At the very beginning of the 17th century, it underwent a siege of 3 weeks and lost 13,000 people. The casualties of war proper being assisted by famine and disease. Count Dracula had directed me to go to the Golden Krone Hotel, which I found, to my great delight, to be thoroughly old-fashioned, for of course I wanted to see all I could of the ways of the country. I was evidently expected, for when I got near the door I faced a cheery-looking elderly woman in the usual peasant dress, white undergarment with long double apron, front and back, of colored stuff fitting almost too tight for modesty. When I came close, she bowed and said, "The Herr Englishman?" "Yes," I said, "Jonathan Harker." She smiled and gave some message to an elderly man in white shirt sleeves who had followed her to the door. He went, but immediately returned with a letter. "My friend, Welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight. At 3 tomorrow, the diligence will start for Bukovina. A place on it is kept for you. At the Borgo Pass, my carriage will await you and will bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been a happy one. In this passage from Early in Dracula by Bram Stoker, Jonathan Harker arrives at the Golden Krone Hotel in Transylvania, delighted by its old-fashioned charm as he wishes to immerse himself in the local culture. He is warmly greeted by an elderly woman in traditional peasant attire who recognizes him as the expected Herr Englishman, and after confirming his identity, she relays a message to an elderly man who brings Harker a welcoming letter from Count Dracula. The letter assures Harker of safe travel arrangements to the Count's estate, expressing hope that his journey from London was pleasant and that he will enjoy his time in the Carpathians, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Dracula. May. I found that my landlord had got a letter from the Count, directing him to secure the best place on the coach for me. But on making inquiries as to details, he seemed somewhat reticent and pretended that he could not understand my German. This could not be true, because up to then he had understood it perfectly. At least he answered my questions exactly as if he did. He and his wife, the old lady who had received me, looked at each other in a frightened sort of way. He mumbled out that the money had been sent in a letter, and that was all he knew. When I asked him if he knew Count Dracula and could tell me anything of his castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and, saying that they knew nothing at all, simply refused to speak further. It was so near the time of starting that I had no time to ask anyone else, for it was all very mysterious and not by any means comforting. Just before I was leaving, the old lady came up to my room and said in a very hysterical way, "Must you go? Oh, young Herr, must you go?" She was in such an excited state that she seemed to have lost her grip of what German she knew, and mixed it all up with some other language which I did not know at all. I was just able to follow her by asking many questions. When I told her that I must go at once, and that I was engaged on important business, she asked again, "Do you know what day it is?" I answered that it was the 4th of May. She shook her head as she said again, "Oh, yes, I know that. I know that. But do you know what day it is?" On my saying that I did not understand, she went on, "It is the eve of St. George Day. Do you not know that tonight, as the narrator prepares to depart on an urgent journey, an old lady approaches him in a state of hysteria, pleading with him not to go, and speaking a mix of German and an unfamiliar language. Despite his attempts to understand her distress, she cryptically warns him about the significance of the date, revealing that it is the eve of St. George's Day, a night when, at midnight, all evil forces are believed to hold power. Her ominous words leave the narrator unsettled as he faces the necessity of leaving immediately for important business. When the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway. Do you know where you are going and what you are going to? She was in such evident distress that I tried to comfort her, but without effect. Finally, she went down on her knees and implored me not to go, at least to wait a day or two before starting. It was all very ridiculous, but I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. I therefore tried to raise her up and said as gravely as I could that I thanked her, but my duty was imperative and that I must go. She then rose and dried her eyes, and taking a crucifix from her neck offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for As an English churchman, I have been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous, and yet it seemed so ungracious to refuse an old lady, meaning so well, and in such a state of mind. She saw, I suppose, the doubt in my face. In this passage, a woman in great distress begs the narrator not to embark on a journey, or at least to delay it by a day or two, even kneeling to plead with him. Despite feeling uneasy, the narrator insists on proceeding due to pressing business, gently refusing her request while acknowledging her concern. Overcome with emotion, she offers him a crucifix for protection, which he hesitantly accepts out of respect for her intentions, despite his reservations as an English churchman. For she put the rosary round my neck and said, "For your mother's sake," and went out of the room. I am writing up this part of the diary whilst I am waiting for the coach, which is, of course, late, and the crucifix is still round my neck. Whether it is the old lady's fear, or the many ghostly traditions of this place, or the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I am not feeling nearly as easy in my mind as usual. If this book should ever reach Mina before I do, let it bring my goodbye. Here comes the coach. 5 May, the castle. The gray of the morning has passed, and the sun is high over the distant horizon, which seems jagged, whether with trees or hills I know not, for it is so far off that big things and little are mixed. I am not sleepy, and, as I am not to be called till I awake, naturally I write till sleep comes. There are many odd things to put down, and lest who reads them may fancy that I dined too well before I left Bistritz, let me put down my dinner exactly. I dined on what they called robber steak, bits of bacon, onion, and beef, seasoned with red pepper, and strung on sticks. In this passage, the narrator is writing in their diary while awaiting a delayed coach, feeling uneasy due to the local superstitions, the atmosphere of the place, or the crucifix they wear, and bids a potential farewell to Mina in case they do not return. The coach arrives, and later, on May 5th at the castle, the narrator describes the morning landscape with a distant, jagged horizon, and unable to sleep, continues writing about odd experiences and a meal called robber steak made of bacon, onion, and beef, seasoned with red pepper and cooked over a fire, and roasted over the fire in the simple style of the London cat's meat. The wine was golden mediash, which produces a queer sting on the tongue, which is, however, not disagreeable. I had only a couple of glasses of this and nothing else. When I got on the coach, the driver had not taken his seat, and I saw him talking with the landlady. They were evidently talking of me, for every now and then they looked at me, and some of the people who were sitting on the bench outside the door, which they call by a name meaning word bearer, came and listened, and then looked at me, most of them pityingly. I could hear a lot of words often repeated, queer words, for there were many nationalities in the crowd, so I quietly got my polyglot dictionary from my bag and looked them out. I must say they were not cheering to me, for amongst them were Ordog, Satan, Pokol, Hell, Stragoica, Witch, Vrolok, and Volkoslak. Both in this passage, the narrator drinks a unique wine called Golden Mediash, noting its peculiar but not unpleasant taste, limiting himself to just 2 glasses. While waiting for the coach driver, who is conversing with the landlady, the narrator observes that their discussion seems to concern him, as they and others nearby glance at him with pity. Overhearing strange, repeated words from the multilingual crowd, he consults his dictionary and discovers unsettling terms like Satan, hell, witch, werewolf, and vampire, hinting at ominous local beliefs or fears about his journey, both of which mean the same thing: one being Slovak and the other Servian, for something that is either werewolf or vampire. Mem, I must ask the Count about these superstitions. When we started, the crowd round the inn door, which had by this time swelled to a considerable size, all made the sign of the cross and pointed two fingers towards me. With some difficulty, I got a fellow passenger to tell me what they meant. He would not answer at first, but on learning that I was English, he explained that it was a charm or guard against the evil eye. This was not very pleasant for me, just starting for an unknown place to meet an unknown man. But everyone seemed so kind-hearted and so sorrowful and so sympathetic that I could not but be touched. I shall never forget the last glimpse which I had of the inn yard and its crowd of picturesque figures, all crossing themselves as they stood round the wide archway. As the narrator prepares to depart from an inn, a large crowd gathers, making the sign of the cross and gesturing with two fingers toward the narrator as a protective charm against the evil eye, as explained by a fellow passenger. Despite the unsettling nature of this superstition, the narrator is moved by the crowd's kind, sorrowful, and sympathetic demeanor. The scene is vividly etched in memory, with the inn yard filled with picturesque figures crossing themselves, framed by lush oleander and orange trees in tubs, with its background of rich foliage of oleander and orange trees in green tubs clustered in the center of the yard. Then our driver, whose wide linen drawers covered the whole front of the box seat, Gotza they call them, cracked his big whip over his four small horses, which ran abreast, and we set off on our journey. I soon lost sight and recollection of ghostly fears in the beauty of the scene as we drove along. Although had I known the language, or rather languages, which my fellow passengers were speaking, I might not have been able to throw them off so easily. Before us lay a green sloping land full of forests and woods, with here and there steep hills crowned with clumps of trees or with farmhouses, the blank gable end to the road. There was everywhere a bewildering mass of fruit blossom. The narrator begins a journey in a carriage driven by a man in wide linen trousers, using a whip to urge four small horses forward. As they travel, the narrator is captivated by the picturesque landscape of green slopes, forests, steep hills topped with trees or farmhouses, and an abundance of fruit blossoms including apple, plum, pear, and cherry. Despite not understanding the languages spoken by fellow passengers, the beauty of the scenery helps dispel any lingering ghostly fears. Apple, plum, pear, cherry, and as we drove by I could see the green grass under the trees spangled with the fallen petals. In and out amongst these green hills of what they call here the Middle Land ran the road, losing itself as it swept round the grassy curve, or was shut out by the straggling ends of pine woods, which here and there ran down the hillsides like tongues of flame. The road was rugged, but still we seemed to fly over it with a feverish haste. I could not understand then what the haste meant, but the driver was evidently bent on losing no time in reaching Borgo Prund. I was told that this road is in summertime excellent, but that it had not yet been put in order after the winter snows. In this respect it is different from the general run of roads in the Carpathians, for it is an old tradition that they are not to be kept in too good order. Of old, the Hospodars would not repair them lest the Turks should think that they were preparing to bring in foreign troops, and so hasten the war which was always really at loading point. Beyond the green swelling The passage describes a journey through the Middle Land, a region of green hills where a rugged road winds through grassy curves and pine woods that descend the hillsides. The narrator notes the driver's urgent haste to reach Borgo Prund, despite the road's poor condition after winter snows, a contrast to the typical neglect of Carpathian roads due to historical fears of facilitating foreign invasion. Beyond the hills, the landscape ascends into the forested, towering slopes of the Carpathian Mountains. Hills of the Middle Land rose mighty slopes of forest up to the lofty steeps of the Carpathians themselves. Right and left of us they towered, with the afternoon sun falling full upon them and bringing out all the glorious colors of this beautiful range. Deep blue and purple in the shadows of the peaks, green and brown where grass and rock mingled, and an endless perspective of jagged rock and pointed crags, till these were themselves lost in the distance, where the snowy peaks rose grandly. Here and there seemed mighty rifts in the mountains, through which, as the sun began to sink, we saw now and again the white gleam of falling water. One of my companions touched my arm as we swept round the base of a hill and opened up the lofty, snow-covered peak of a mountain which seemed, as we wound on our serpentine way, to be right before us. Look, Easton Shed. In this passage, the narrator describes a breathtaking journey through a mountain range bathed in afternoon sunlight, revealing a spectrum of colors from deep blue and purple in the shadows to green and brown on grassy, rocky slopes, with jagged peaks stretching into the distance toward snowy summits. As the sun begins to set, glimpses of white waterfalls appear through vast mountain rifts. A companion, struck by the sight of a towering, snow-covered peak ahead, reverently refers to it as God's seat and makes a sign of the cross while the group continues their winding path. God's seat, and he crossed himself reverently. As we wound on our endless way and the sun sank lower and lower, behind us, the shadows of the evening began to creep round us. This was emphasized by the fact that the snowy mountain top still held the sunset and seemed to glow out with a delicate, cool pink. Here and there we passed Czechs and Slovaks, all in picturesque attire. But I noticed that Goitra was painfully prevalent. By the roadside were many crosses, and as we swept by, my companions all crossed themselves. Here and there was a peasant man or woman kneeling before a shrine, who did not even turn round as we approached, but seemed in the self-surrender of devotion to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world. There were many things new to me, for instance, hayricks in the trees, and here and there very beautiful masses of weeping birch, their white stems shining like silver through the delicate green of the leaves. Now and again we passed a leader wagon, the ordinary peasant's cart, with its long, snake-like vertebra, calculated to suit the inequalities of the road. On this were sure to be seated quite a group of homecoming peasants. As evening shadows gathered, the narrator observed the lingering sunset casting a cool pink glow on a snowy mountain top. While traveling, they passed Czechs and Slovaks in traditional clothing, noting the prevalence of Goitra, roadside crosses prompting companions to cross themselves, and devout peasants praying at shrines oblivious to their surroundings. The landscape featured unique sights like hayricks and trees, shimmering weeping birches, and peasant carts carrying groups of locals distinguished by their attire and tools. Peasants, the Czechs with their white, and the Slovaks with their colored sheepskins, the latter carrying lance fashion their long staves with axe at end. As the evening fell, it began to get very cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness, the gloom of the trees, oak, beech, and pine, though in the valleys which ran deep Between the spurs of the hills, as we ascended through the pass, the dark firs stood out here and there against the background of late-lying snow. Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine woods that seemed in the darkness to be closing down upon us, great masses of grayness which here and there bestrewed the trees produced a peculiarly weird and solemn effect, which carried on the thoughts and grim fancies engendered earlier in the evening, when the falling sunset threw into strange relief the ghost-like clouds which amongst the Carpathians seemed to wind ceaselessly through the valleys. Sometimes the hills were so steep that despite our driver's haste, the horses could only go slowly. I wished to get down and walk up them as we do. As evening descended, the cold intensified, and the twilight blended the shadowy outlines of oak, beech, and pine trees into a dark mist, with valleys revealing dark firs against lingering snow as the narrator ascended through a mountain pass. The eerie atmosphere was heightened by the dense pine woods and ghostly gray masses on the trees, echoing the unsettling impressions of the sunset and the winding clouds of the Carpathians. The steep hills slowed the horses despite the driver's urgency, and though the narrator wished to walk, the driver refused, citing the danger of fierce dogs. Do at home, but the driver would not hear of it. No, no, he said, you must not walk here. The dogs are too fierce. And then he added, with what he evidently meant for grim pleasantry, for he looked round to catch the approving smile of the rest, and you may have enough of such matters before you go to sleep. The only stop he would make was a moment's pause to light his lamps. When it grew dark, there seemed to be some excitement amongst the passengers, and they kept speaking to him, one after the other, as though urging him to further speed. He lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, and with wild cries encouragement urged them on to further exertions. Then through the darkness I could see a sort of patch of gray light ahead of us, as though there were a cleft in the hills. The excitement of the passengers grew greater. The crazy coach rocked on its great leather springs and swayed like a boat tossed on a stormy sea. I had to hold on. The road grew more level, and we appeared to fly along. Then the mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side and to frown down upon us. We were entering on the Borgo Pass. One by one, several of the passengers offered me gifts, which they pressed upon me with an earnestness which would take no denial. These were certainly of an odd and varied kind, but each was given in simple good faith, with a kindly word and a blessing, and that strange mixture of fear-meaning movements which I had seen outside the hotel at Bistritz, the sign of the cross, and the guard against the evil eye. Then, as we flew along, the driver leaned forward, and on each side the passengers, craning over the edge of the coach, peered eagerly into the darkness. It was evident that something very exciting was either happening or expected, but though I asked each passenger, no one would give me the slightest explanation. This state of excitement kept on for some little time, and at last we saw before us the pass opening out on the eastern side. There were dark rolling clouds overhead, and in the air the heavy oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had set. In this passage, passengers on a coach present the narrator with peculiar gifts, given with sincere kindness and accompanied by protective gestures like the sign of the cross, hinting at a shared fear or superstition. As the journey continues, the passengers and driver grow visibly excited, peering into the darkness with anticipation. Though none will explain the reason to the narrator, the atmosphere becomes tense with dark clouds and the threat of thunder as they reach a mountain pass. where the narrator awaits a connection to meet the count, separated two atmospheres, and that now we had got into the thunderous one. I was now myself looking out for the conveyance which was to take me to the Count. Each moment I expected to see the glare of lamps through the blackness, but all was dark. The only light was the flickering rays of our own lamps, in which the steam from our hard-driven horses rose in a white cloud. We could see now the sandy road lying white before us, but there was on it no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness, which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I had best do, when the driver, looking at his watch, said to the others something which I could hardly hear. It was spoken so quietly and in so low a tone, I thought it was an hour less than the time. Then turning to me, he said in German worse than my own, "There is no carriage here. The Herr is not expected after all. He will now come on to Bukovina, and return tomorrow or the next day, better the next day." Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly, so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst in this passage, the narrator and fellow passengers are traveling at night, expecting to meet a carriage, but find no sign of it on the dark, sandy road illuminated only by their own lamps. Disappointed, the narrator learns from the driver that the expected person, referred to as the Herr, is not coming and will instead arrive in Bukovina the following day or later. As they discuss this, a sudden commotion arises, with the horses becoming agitated, and amidst the passengers' screams and gestures of fear, a 4-horse caleche unexpectedly appears and pulls up beside their coach. Next, a chorus of screams from the peasants and a universal crossing of themselves, a caleche with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps as the rays fell on them that the horses were coal-black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight, as he turned to us. He said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend." The man stammered in reply. The English Herr was in a hurry, to which the stranger replied, "That is why I suppose you wished him to go on to Bukovina. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much, and my horses are swift." As he spoke, he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth, as white as ivory. In this passage, a group encounters a mysterious tall man driving coal-black horses, his face partially obscured by a large black hat, revealing only his bright, seemingly red eyes in the lamplight. The man speaks to the driver, noting their early arrival and suggesting he knows the traveler's urgency to reach Bukovina, displaying an unsettling awareness and confidence. As he smiles, his hard mouth, red lips, and sharp ivory-white teeth are illuminated, prompting a whispered reference to a line from Burger's Lenore about the dead traveling fast, hinting at an eerie supernatural presence. One of my companions whispered to another the line from Burger's Lenore, "Den die Toten reiten schnell," for the dead travel fast. The strange driver evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a gleaming smile. The passenger turned his face away, at the same time putting out his 2 fingers and crossing himself. "Give me the Herr's luggage," said the driver, and with exceeding alacrity my bags were handed out and put in the caleche. Then I descended from the side of the coach, as the caleche was close alongside, the driver helping me with a hand which caught my arm in a grip of steel. His strength must have been prodigious. Without a word, he shook his reins, the horses turned, and we swept into the darkness of the pass. As I looked back, I saw the steam from the horses of the coach by the light of the lamp. In this passage, a passenger prepares to depart with a mysterious driver in a caleche, a type of carriage. After the driver, displaying remarkable strength, assists with the luggage and helps the passenger aboard with a powerful grip, they set off into the dark pass without a word. As they leave, the passenger glances back to see the steam from the horses and the figures of their former companions making the sign of the cross, while the driver urges the horses onward toward Bukovina. Lamps, and projected against it the figures of my late companions crossing themselves. Then the driver cracked his whip and called to his horses, and off they swept on their way to Bukovina. As they sank into the darkness, I felt a strange chill, and a lonely feeling came over me, but a cloak was thrown over my shoulders and a rug across my knees, and the driver said in excellent German, "The night is chill, mein Herr, and my master the Count bade me take all care of you. There is a flask of Slivovitz, the plum brandy of the country, underneath the seat, if you should require it." I did not take any, but it was a comfort to know it was there all the same. I felt a little strangely, and not a little frightened. I think had there been any alternative, I should have taken it instead of prosecuting that unknown night journey. The carriage went at a hard pace straight along, then we made a complete turn and went along another straight road. It seemed to me that we were simply going over and over the same ground again, and so I took note of some salient point and found that this was so. I would have liked to have asked. In this passage, the narrator experiences an eerie chill and loneliness as they descend into darkness during a night journey. The driver, speaking fluent German, offers a cloak, a rug, and a flask of Slivovitz for comfort, following the instructions of his master, the Count, though the narrator declines the drink. Feeling uneasy and frightened, the narrator notices the carriage seems to be traveling in circles over the same ground, but hesitates to question the driver, fearing any protest would be futile. The driver what this all meant, but I really feared to do so, for I thought that, placed as I was, any protest would have had no effect in case there had been an intention to delay. By and by, however, as I was curious to know how time was passing, I struck a match, and by its flame looked at my watch. It was within a few minutes of midnight. This gave me a sort of shock, for I supposed the general superstition about midnight was increased by my recent experiences. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in a farmhouse far down the road, a long, agonized wailing, as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another and another, till, borne on the wind which now sighed. As midnight approached, the narrator, driven by curiosity, lit a match to check the time on their watch, feeling a jolt of unease due to the superstitious significance of the hour and recent unsettling events. A dog's fearful, drawn-out howl echoed from a distant farmhouse, soon joined by others, creating a widespread, eerie chorus that filled the night air. This haunting sound, carried by a gentle wind through the pass, seemed to envelop the entire countryside in an ominous atmosphere. Glide softly through the pass, a wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp it through the gloom of the night. At the first howl, the horses began to strain and rear, but the driver spoke to them soothingly, and they quieted down, but shivered and sweated as though after a runaway from sudden fright. Then, far off in the distance, from the mountains on each side of us, began a louder and a sharper howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way, for I was minded to jump from the caleche and run, whilst they reared again and plunged madly, so that the driver had to to use all his great strength to keep them from bolting. In a few minutes, however, my own ears got accustomed to the sound, and the horses so far became quiet that the driver was able to descend and to stand before them. As a distant howl pierces the air, the horses pulling the caleche become agitated, rearing and straining in fear, though the driver calms them with soothing words. A louder, sharper howling of wolves from the surrounding mountains intensifies their panic and unsettles the narrator, who feels an urge to flee, while the driver struggles to control the horses. Eventually, the narrator grows accustomed to the sound, and the driver, stepping down to comfort the horses with whispers and caresses, successfully calms them, though they remain visibly shaken. He petted and soothed them and whispered something in their ears, as I have heard of horse tamers doing, and with extraordinary effect, for under his caresses they became quite manageable again, though they still trembled. The driver again took his seat, and shaking his reins, started off at a great pace. This time, after going to the far side of the pass, he suddenly turned down a narrow roadway which ran sharply to the right. Soon we were hemmed in with trees, which in places arched right over the roadway, till we passed as through a tunnel, and again great frowning rocks guarded us boldly on either side. Though we were in shelter, we could hear the rising wind, for it moaned and whistled through the rocks, and the branches of the trees crashed together as we swept along. It grew colder and colder still, and fine. Powdery snow began to fall, so that soon we and all around us were covered with a white blanket. The keen wind still. The driver urged the horses forward at a rapid pace, veering onto a narrow, sharp-turning road surrounded by dense trees that formed a tunnel-like canopy. As they progressed, towering rocks flanked the path, and a rising wind howled through the landscape, accompanied by crashing branches and falling powdery snow that blanketed everything. The distant howling of dogs faded, but the encroaching cries of wolves grew closer, heightening the fear felt by both the narrator and the horses. Carried the howling of the dogs, though this grew fainter as we went on our way. The baying of the wolves sounded nearer and nearer, as though they were closing round on us from every side. I grew dreadfully afraid, and the horses shared my fear. The driver, however, was not in the least disturbed. He kept turning his head to left and right, but I could not see anything through the darkness. Suddenly, away on our left, I saw a faint flickering blue flame. The driver saw it at the same moment. He at once checked the horses, and jumping to the ground, disappeared into the darkness. I did not know what to do, the less as the howling of the wolves grew closer. But while I wondered, the driver suddenly appeared again, and without a word took his seat, and we resumed our journey. I think I must have fallen asleep and kept dreaming of the incident, for it seemed to be repeated endlessly, and now looking back, it is like a sort of awful nightmare. Once the flame appeared so near the road that even in the darkness. In this passage, a passenger describes a tense journey through a dark, eerie landscape where the driver remains calm despite the surrounding darkness and the howling of nearby wolves. The passenger notices a faint blue flame on the left, prompting the driver to stop the horses, investigate the flame, and then silently resume the journey. This mysterious event, involving the driver arranging stones near the flame, repeats in the passenger's mind, blending into a nightmarish memory. Around us, I could watch the driver's motions. He went rapidly to where the blue flame arose. It must have been very faint, for it did not seem to illumine the place around it at all, and gathering a few stones, formed them into some device. Once there appeared a strange optical effect. When he stood between me and the flame, he did not obstruct it, for I could see its ghostly flicker all the same. This startled me, but as the effect was only momentary, I took it that my eyes deceived me, straining through the darkness. Then for a time there were no blue flames, and we sped onwards through the gloom, with the howling of the wolves around us, as though they were following in a moving circle. At last, there came a time when the driver went further afield than. In this passage, a peculiar optical phenomenon occurs when a figure stands between the narrator and a flame, yet the flame remains visible as if unobstructed, briefly startling the narrator, who attributes it to strained vision in the darkness. As they continue through the gloom, the blue flames disappear, and they are surrounded by the howling of wolves, seemingly encircling them. Eventually, the driver ventures farther away, and during his absence, the horses become extremely agitated, trembling and screaming in fear, though the wolves' howling has stopped and no apparent cause for their distress is visible. He had yet gone, and during his absence, the horses began to tremble worse than ever, and to snort and scream with fright. I could not see any cause for it, for the howling of the wolves had ceased altogether, but just then the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of a beetling, pine-clad rock, and by its light I saw around us a ring of wolves, with white teeth and lolling red tongues, with long sinewy limbs and shaggy hair. They were 100 times more terrible in the grim silence which held them than even when they howled. For myself, I felt a sort of paralysis of fear. It is only when a man feels himself face to face with such horrors that he can understand their true import. All at once, the wolves began to howl as though the moonlight had had some peculiar effect on them. The horses jumped about and reared and looked helplessly round with eyes that rolled in a way painful to see. But the living ring of terror encompassed them on every side, and they had perforce to remain within it. I called to the coachman to come, for it seemed to me that our only chance was to try to break out. In this passage, the narrator, illuminated by moonlight piercing through dark clouds, discovers a menacing circle of wolves surrounding them, their silent ferocity instilling a paralyzing fear. As the wolves begin to howl, seemingly triggered by the moonlight, the horses panic within the inescapable ring of predators. Desperate to escape, the narrator calls for the coachman and creates noise by shouting and striking the carriage, hoping to distract the wolves and clear a path for the coachman to reach safety through the ring and to aid his approach. I shouted and beat the side of the caleche, hoping by the noise to scare the wolves from that side so as to give him a chance of reaching the trap. How he came there, I know not, but I heard his voice raised in a tone of imperious command, and looking towards the sound, saw him stand in the roadway. As he swept his long arms, as though brushing aside some impalpable obstacle, the wolves fell back and back, further still. Just then a heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon so that we were again in darkness. When I could see again, the driver was climbing into the caleche and the wolves had disappeared. This was all so strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me and I was afraid to speak or move. The time seemed interminable as we swept on our way, now in almost complete darkness, for the rolling clouds obscured the moon. We kept on ascending with occasional periods of quick descent, but in the main. In this passage, the narrator hears a commanding voice and sees a man in the roadway, gesturing forcefully to drive back a pack of wolves. As a cloud obscures the moon, plunging the scene into darkness, the wolves vanish and the driver returns to the carriage to continue the journey. The narrator, gripped by fear, remains silent as they travel through near total darkness, ascending toward a vast, ruined castle with no visible light in its windows. Always ascending. Suddenly, I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky. Chapter 2. Jonathan Harker's Journal, continued 5th May. I must have been asleep, for certainly if I had been fully awake, I must have noticed the approach of such a remarkable place. In the gloom, the courtyard looked of considerable size, and as several dark ways led from it under great round arches, it perhaps seemed bigger than it really is. I have not yet been able to see it by daylight. When the caleche stopped, the driver jumped down and held out his hand to assist me to alight. Again, I could not but notice his prodigious strength. His hand actually seemed like a steel vise that could have crushed mine if he had chosen. Then he took out my traps and placed them on the ground beside me as I stood close to a great. In this passage from Jonathan Harker's journal, dated May 5th, he arrives at a mysterious and imposing location, likely a castle, under the cover of night after possibly falling asleep during the journey. He describes the vast, shadowy courtyard surrounded by dark archways and a massive, ancient door set in weathered, carved stone. As he alights from the carriage, he notes the driver's extraordinary strength, likening his grip to a steel vise, before his luggage is placed beside him at the entrance. Door, old and studded with large iron nails, and set in a projecting doorway of massive stone. I could see even in the dim light that the stone was massively carved, but that the carving had been much worn by time and weather. As I stood, the driver jumped again into his seat and shook the reins. The horses started forward, and trap and all disappeared down one of the dark openings. I stood in silence where I was, for I did not know what to do. Of bell or knocker there was no sign. Through these frowning walls and dark window openings, it was not likely that my voice could penetrate. The time I waited seemed endless, and I felt doubts and fears crowding upon me. What sort of place had I come to, and among what kind of people? What sort of grim adventure was it on which I had embarked? Was this a customary incident in the life of a solicitor's clerk sent out to explain the purchase of a London estate to a foreigner? Solicitor's clerk? Mina would not like that. Solicitor, for just before leaving London I got word that my examination was successful, and I am now a full-blown solicitor. In this passage, the narrator watches as the driver and carriage depart, leaving him alone in a dark, unfamiliar place with no clear way to seek help or enter the building before him. Overwhelmed by doubts and fears, he questions the nature of the place and people he has encountered, as well as the strange adventure he has undertaken as a solicitor's clerk, though he corrects himself, noting his recent success in becoming a full solicitor. Feeling trapped in a nightmarish situation, he struggles to discern whether he is awake or dreaming, longing to find himself safely back home. I began to rub my eyes and pinch myself to see if I were awake. It all seemed like a horrible nightmare to me, and I expected that I should suddenly awake and find myself at home, with the dawn struggling in through the windows, as I had now and again felt in the morning after a day of overwork. But my flesh answered the pinching test, and my eyes were not to be deceived. I was indeed awake and among the Carpathians. All I could do now was to be patient and to wait the coming of the morning. Just as I had come to this conclusion, I heard a heavy step approaching behind the great door, and saw through the chinks the gleam of a coming light. Then there was the sound of rattling chains and the clanking of massive bolts drawn back. A key was turned with the loud grating noise of long disuse, and the great door swung back. Within stood a tall old man, clean-shaven save for a long white mustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without. The narrator, feeling the physical reality of their situation, confirms they are awake and in the Carpathian Mountains, deciding to patiently await morning. A heavy step and the sound of chains and bolts signal someone approaching, and a large door opens to reveal a tall, old man, dressed entirely in black with a white mustache, holding a flickering antique silver lamp that casts eerie shadows. A single speck of color about him anywhere. He held in his hand an antique silver lamp in which the flame burned without chimney or globe of any kind, throwing long quivering shadows as it flickered in the draught of the open door. The old man motioned me in with his right hand with a courtly gesture, saying in excellent English, but with a strange intonation, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will." He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into stone. The instant, however, that I had stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength which made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed as cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead than a living man. Again he said, "Welcome to my house. Come freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring." The strength of the handshake was so much akin to that which I had noticed in the driver, whose face I had not seen, that for a moment I doubted if it were an old man speaking excellent English with a peculiar accent welcomes the narrator into his home with a formal gesture, urging him to enter freely. As the narrator crosses the threshold, the old man suddenly moves forward, gripping his hand with an icy, powerful shake that feels almost lifeless, reminiscent of a previous encounter with a mysterious driver. Confirming his identity with a courteous bow, the man reveals himself as Count Dracula and warmly welcomes the narrator, Mr. Harker, to his house. Not the same person to whom I was speaking, so to make sure I said, interrogatively, "Count Dracula." He bowed in a courtly way as he replied, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in. The night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." As he was speaking, he put the lamp on a bracket on the wall, and stepping out, took my luggage. He had carried it in before I could forestall him. I protested, but he insisted, "Nay, sir, you are my guest. It is late, and my people are not available. Let me see to your comfort myself." He insisted on carrying my traps along the passage, and then up a great winding stair, and along another great passage, on whose stone floor our steps rang heavily. At the end of this he threw open a heavy door, and I rejoiced to see within a well-lit room in which a table was spread for supper, and on whose mighty hearth a great fire of logs, freshly replenished, flamed and flared. The Count halted, putting down my bags, closed the door, and crossing the room, opened another door, which led into a small octagonal room lit by a single lamp, and seemingly without a window of any sort. Passing through this, he opened another door and motioned me to enter. It was a welcome sight, for here was a great bedroom, well lighted and warmed with another log fire, also added to but lately, for the top logs were fresh, which sent a hollow roar up the wide chimney. The Count himself left my luggage inside and withdrew, saying before he closed the door, "You will need, after your journey, to refresh yourself by making your toilet. I trust you will find all you wish. When you are ready, come into the other room, where you will find your supper prepared." The Count escorted the narrator to a small, windowless, octagonal room illuminated by a single lamp, then guided them into a spacious, well-lit bedroom, warmed by a fresh log fire. After leaving the luggage and offering a courteous welcome, the Count instructed the narrator to refresh themselves before joining him in another room for supper. Feeling reassured by the warmth and hospitality, the narrator quickly freshened up, driven by hunger, and found supper already prepared in the adjacent room. The light and warmth and the Count's courteous welcome seemed to have dissipated all my doubts and fears. Having then reached my normal state, I discovered that I was half famished with hunger. So making a hasty toilet, I went into the other room. I found supper already laid out. My host, who stood on one side of the great fireplace, leaning against the stonework, made a graceful wave of his hand to the table and said, "I pray you, be seated and sup how you please. You will, I trust, excuse me that I do not join you, but I have dined already and I do not sup." I handed to him the sealed letter which Mr. Hawkins had entrusted to me. He opened it and read it gravely. Then, with a charming smile, he handed it to me to read. One passage of it, at least, gave me a thrill of pleasure. I must regret that an attack of gout, from which in this passage, the host courteously invites the narrator to sit and eat at the table by the fireplace, while explaining that he has already dined and will not join in the meal. The narrator then hands the host a sealed letter from Mr. Hawkins, which the host reads seriously before returning it with a warm smile. The letter reveals that Mr. Hawkins, unable to travel due to gout, is sending a capable and trustworthy young man as his substitute, described as energetic, talented, and loyal. Malady, I am a constant sufferer, forbids absolutely any traveling on my part for some time to come, but I'm happy to say I can send a sufficient substitute, one in whom I have every possible confidence. He is a young man full of energy and talent in his own way, and of a very faithful disposition. He is discreet and silent, and has grown into manhood in my service. He shall be ready to attend on you when you will during his stay, and shall take your instructions in all matters. The Count himself came forward and took off the cover of a dish, and I fell to at once on an excellent roast chicken. This, with some cheese and a salad and a bottle of old Tokay, of which I had 2 glasses, was my supper. During the time I was eating it, the Count asked me many questions as to my journey, and I told him by degrees all. In this passage, a loyal and discreet servant who has grown up in the Count's service is assigned to assist the narrator during his stay. The Count personally serves the narrator a hearty supper of roast chicken, cheese, salad, and Tokay wine, engaging him in conversation about his journey while he eats. After supper, at the Count's invitation, the narrator relaxes by the fire with a cigar, taking the opportunity to closely observe the Count's distinctive facial features I had experienced. By this time I had finished my supper, and by my host's desire had drawn up a chair by the fire and begun to smoke a cigar, which he offered me, at the same time excusing himself that he did not smoke. I had now an opportunity of observing him, and found him of a very marked physiognomy. His face was a very strong, aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead and hair growing scantily round the temples but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy mustache, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. For the rest, his ears were pale, and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm, though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. Hitherto I had noticed the backs of his hands as they lay. This passage describes a man with striking, almost unsettling physical features, including a strong aquiline face with a high-bridged nose, arched nostrils, and a domed forehead framed by scant hair at the temples but thick elsewhere. His heavy eyebrows nearly meet over the nose. His mouth appears cruel with sharp protruding teeth and vivid red lips, and his pale complexion contrasts with pointed ears and a strong chin. The narrator also notes the man's hands, which are broad and coarse with squat fingers, hairy palms, and long pointed nails, adding to the eerie and powerful impression of his appearance. On his knees in the firelight, and they had seemed rather white and fine, but seeing them now close to me, I could not but notice that they were rather coarse, broad, with squat fingers. Strange to say, there were hairs in the center of the palm. The nails were long and fine and cut to a sharp point. As the Count leaned over me and his hands touched me, I could not repress a shudder. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me, which, do what I would, I could not conceal. The Count, evidently noticing it, drew back, and with a grim sort of smile, which showed more than he had yet done his protuberant teeth, sat himself down again on his own side of the fireplace. We were both silent for a while, and as I looked towards the window, I saw the first dim streak of the coming dawn. There seemed a strange stillness over everything, but as I listened, I heard, as if from down below in the valley, the howling of many wolves. The Count's eyes gleamed, and he said, "Listen to them, the children of the night. What music they make!" Seeing, I suppose, some expression in my face strange to him, he added, "Sarumwa." In this passage, the narrator experiences intense discomfort and nausea as the Count leans over him, a reaction he cannot hide despite his efforts. Noticing this, the Count withdraws with a grim smile, revealing his prominent teeth, and both remain silent until the narrator observes the faint light of dawn and hears wolves howling in the valley below. The Count, with gleaming eyes, refers to the wolves as children of the night and their howls as music, then excuses himself, ensuring the narrator's comfort in a prepared bedroom while he is away until the afternoon. You dwellers in the city cannot enter into the feelings of the hunter." Then he rose and said, "But you must be tired. Your bedroom is all ready, and tomorrow you shall sleep as late as you will. I have to be away till the afternoon, so sleep well and dream well." With a courteous bow, he opened for me himself the door to the octagonal room, and I entered my bedroom. I am all in a sea of wonders. I doubt, I fear, I think strange things which I dare not confess to my own soul. God keep me, if only for the sake of those dear to me. 7 May. It is again early morning, but I have rested and enjoyed the last 24 hours. I slept till late in the day and awoke of my own accord. When I had dressed myself, I went into the room where we had supped and found a cold breakfast laid. In this passage, the narrator is welcomed into an octagonal bedroom by a courteous host, feeling overwhelmed by a mix of wonder, doubt, and fear that he keeps to himself. The next morning, on May 7th, after a restful sleep, he finds a cold breakfast prepared with hot coffee and a note from his host, D, indicating an absence and instructing him not to wait. Unable to locate a bell to summon servants after eating, the narrator is left to navigate the unfamiliar surroundings alone. out, with coffee kept hot by the pot being placed on the hearth. There was a card on the table on which was written, "I have to be absent for a while. Do not wait for me. D." I set to and enjoyed a hearty meal. When I had done, I looked for a bell so that I might let the servants know I had finished, but I could not find one. There are certainly odd deficiencies in the house, considering the extraordinary evidences of wealth which are round me. The table service is of gold, and so beautifully wrought that it must be of immense value. The curtains and upholstery of the chairs and sofas and the hangings of my bed are of the costliest and most beautiful fabrics, and must have been of fabulous value when they were made, for they are centuries old, though in excellent order. I saw something like them in Hampton Court, but there they were worn and frayed and moth-eaten. But still in none of the rooms is there a mirror. There is not even a toilet glass on my table, and I had to get the little shaving glass from my bag before I could either shave or brush my hair. I have not yet seen a servant anywhere. In this passage, the narrator observes the striking contrast between the opulent, centuries-old furnishings of the castle, gold tableware, exquisite fabrics, and historical decor akin to those at Hampton Court, and peculiar absences, such as the lack of mirrors anywhere in the rooms. Despite the evident wealth, there are no servants visible, and the only sounds are the distant howling of wolves. After a meal taken at an ambiguous hour, the narrator, feeling constrained from exploring without the Count's permission, searches for something to read to pass the time, or heard a sound near the castle except the howling of wolves. Some time after I had finished my meal, I do not know whether to call it breakfast or dinner, for it was between 5 and 6 o'clock when I had it. I looked about for something to read, for I did not like to go about the castle until I had asked the Count's permission. There was absolutely nothing in the room, book, newspaper, or even writing materials, so I opened another door in the room and found a sort of library. The door opposite mine I tried, but found it locked. In the library I found, to my great delight, a vast number of English books, whole shelves full of them, and bound volumes of magazines and newspapers. A table in the center was littered with English magazines and newspapers, though none of them were of very recent date. The books were of the most varied kind: history, geography, politics, political economy, botany, geology, law, all relating to England and English life and customs and manners. There were even such books of reference. In this passage, the narrator explores a room devoid of any reading materials, prompting them to open another door which leads to a library filled with a vast collection of English books, magazines, and newspapers, covering diverse subjects like history, geography, and law, all focused on English life and customs. While examining the books, none of which are very recent, the narrator is interrupted by the Count, who enters the room, greets them warmly, and inquires about their rest. As the London Directory, the Red and Blue Books, Whitaker's Almanac, the Army and Navy lists, and, it somehow gladdened my heart to see it, the Law List. Whilst I was looking at the books, the door opened and the Count entered. He saluted me in a hearty way, and hoped that I had had a good night's rest. Then he went on, "I am glad you found your way in here, for I am sure there is much that will interest you. These companions," and he laid his hand on some of the books, "have been good friends to me, and for some years past, ever since I had the idea of going to London, have given me many, many hours of pleasure. Through them, I have come to know your great England, and to know her is to love her." I long to go through the crowded streets of your mighty London, to be in the midst of the whirl and rush of humanity, to share its life, its change, its death, and all that makes it what it is. But alas, as yet I only know your tongue through books. To you, my friend, I look that I know it to speak. But, Count, I said, in this passage, a character expresses his delight at a visitor's arrival, sharing that the books in his collection have been cherished companions, teaching him about England, a place he yearns to experience firsthand. Despite his deep knowledge of the English language gained through reading, he feels his spoken skills are inadequate, even though the visitor compliments his proficiency. The character humbly insists that he still has much to learn in mastering spoken English. You know and speak English thoroughly, he bowed gravely. I thank you, my friend, for your all too flattering estimate, but yet I fear that I am but a little way on the road I would travel. True, I know the grammar and the words, but yet I know not how to speak them. Indeed, I said, you speak excellently. Not so, he answered. Well, I know that. Did I move and speak in your London? None there are who would not know me for a stranger. That is not enough for me. Here I am noble. I am Boyer. The common people know me, and I am master. But a stranger in a strange land, he is no one. Men know him not, and to know not is to care not for. I am content if I am like the rest, so that no man stops if he see me, or pause in his speaking if he hear my words. Ha, ha, a stranger. I have been so long master that I would be master still, or at least that none other should be. In this passage, a nobleman, likely from a foreign land, expresses his concern about being recognized as a stranger in London, where he would lose the authority and recognition he holds in his homeland. He desires to blend in unnoticed and maintain a sense of mastery over his own identity, resisting being controlled by others. He invites his visitor, an agent representing a friend, to stay and converse with him, hoping to refine his English accent and correct any linguistic mistakes through their interactions. Master of me. You come to me not alone as agent of my friend Peter Hawkins of Exeter to tell me all about my new estate in London. You shall, I trust, rest here with me a while, so that by our talking I may learn the English intonation, and I would that you tell me when I make error, even of the smallest, in my speaking. I am sorry that I had to be away so long today, but you will, I know, forgive one who has so many important affairs in hand. Of course, I said all I could about being willing, and asked if I might come into that room when I chose. He answered, yes, certainly, and added, you may go anywhere you wish in the castle, except where the doors are locked, where of course you will not wish to go. There is reason that all things are as they are, and did you see with my eyes and know with my knowledge, you would perhaps better understand. I said I was sure of this, and then he went on. We are in Transylvania, and Transylvania is not England. Our ways are not your ways, and there shall. In this passage, a character apologizes for a prolonged absence due to important matters and seeks permission to enter a specific room in a castle. The host grants access to most areas of the castle except locked rooms, hinting at hidden reasons for these restrictions, and suggesting that understanding comes with shared perspective. The conversation reveals they are in Transylvania, a place with customs and occurrences vastly different from England, leading to a deeper discussion about the strange experiences the visitor has already encountered. Be to you many strange things. Nay, from what you have told me of your experiences already, you know something of what strange things there may be. This led to much conversation, and as it was evident that he wanted to talk, if only for talking's sake, I asked him many questions regarding things that had already happened to me or come within my notice. Sometimes he sheered off the subject or turned the conversation by pretending not to understand, but generally he answered all I asked most frankly. Then, as time went on and I had got somewhat bolder, I asked him of some of the strange things of the preceding night, as, for instance, why the coachman went to the places where he had seen the blue flames. He then explained to me that it was commonly believed that on a certain night of the year, last night in fact, when all evil spirits are supposed to have unchecked sway, a blue flame is seen over any place where treasure has been concealed. In this passage, the narrator engages in a candid conversation with a character who initially avoids certain topics but eventually responds openly to questions. When asked about the previous night's mysterious events, particularly why the coachman visited locations marked by blue flames, the character reveals a local belief that on a specific night each year, when evil spirits are thought to roam freely, blue flames appear over hidden treasure. He further notes that the area the narrator traveled through, steeped in history and conflict among Wallachians, Saxons, and Turks, is likely rich with such concealed wealth as the soil itself bears the blood of countless fighters. That treasure has been hidden, he went on, in the region through which you came last night. There can be but little doubt, for it was the ground fought over for centuries by the Wallachian, the Saxon, and the Turk. Why, there is hardly a foot of soil in all this region that has not been enriched by the blood of men, patriots, or invaders. In old days there were stirring times when the Austrian and the Hungarian came up in hordes, and the patriots went out to meet them, men and women, the aged and the children too, and waited their coming on the rocks above the passes, that they might sweep destruction on them with their artificial avalanches. When the invader was triumphant, he found but little, for whatever there was had been sheltered in the friendly soil. But how, said I, can it have remained so long undiscovered, when there is a sure index to it if men will but take the trouble to look? The Count smiled, and as his lips ran back over his gums, the long, sharp canine teeth showed out strangely. He answered, "Because your peasant is at heart a coward and a fool. Those flames only appear on one night, and on that night no man of this land will, if he can help it, stir without his doors. And, dear sir, even if he did, he would not know what to do. Why, even the peasant that you tell me of who marked the place of the flame would not know where to look in daylight even for his own work. Even you would not, I dare be sworn, be able to find these places again." "There you are right," I said. "I know no more than the dead, where even to look for them." Then we drifted into other matters. "Come," he said at last, "tell me of London and of the house which you have procured for me." With an apology for my remissness, I went into my own room to get the papers from my bag. Whilst I was placing them in order, I heard a rattling of china and silver in the next room, and as I passed through, noticed that the table had been cleared and the lamp lit, for it was by this time deep into the dark. The lamps were also lit in the study or library, and I found the Count lying on the sofa, reading, of all things in the world, an English Bradshaw's Guide. In this passage, the narrator admits to being unable to locate certain places again, confirming a shared uncertainty with his companion, the Count. Their conversation shifts to London and a house the narrator has secured for the Count, prompting the narrator to retrieve relevant papers from his room. Upon returning, he finds the Count engrossed in an English Bradshaw's Guide, and they proceed to discuss detailed plans, deeds, and local information, with the Count revealing a surprisingly thorough prior knowledge of the area. When I came in, he cleared the books and papers from the table, and with him I went into plans and deeds and figures of all sorts. He was interested in everything, and asked me a myriad questions about the place and its surroundings. He clearly had studied beforehand all he could get on the subject of the neighborhood, for he evidently at the end knew very much more than I did. When I remarked this, he answered, "Well, but my friend, is it not needful that I should? When I go there, I shall be all alone. And my friend Harker Jonathan, nay, pardon me, I fall into my country's habit of putting your patronymic first. My friend Jonathan Harker will not be by my side to correct and aid me. He will be in Exeter, miles away, probably working at papers of the law with my other friend, Peter Hawkins." So we went thoroughly into the business of the purchase of the estate at Purfleet. When I had told him the facts and got his signature to the necessary papers, and had written a letter with them ready to post to Mr. Hawkins, he began to ask me how I had come across so suitable a place. I read to him the notes which in this passage, a character explains the necessity of handling a task alone, as his friend Jonathan Harker will be in Exeter, working on legal documents with Peter Hawkins. The discussion then shifts to the purchase of an estate at Purfleet, where the speaker finalizes the transaction with the necessary signatures and correspondence. He also shares details of discovering the estate, describing it as a neglected property with an ancient, unrepaired high wall found by chance on a by road with a for sale notice I had made at the time, and which I inscribe here, "At Purfleet, on a by road, I came across just such a place as seemed to be required, and where was displayed a dilapidated notice that the place was for sale. It is surrounded by a high wall of ancient structure, built of heavy stones, and has not been repaired for a large number of years. The closed gates are of heavy old oak and iron, all eaten with rust. The estate is called Carfax, no doubt a corruption of the old Quatre Faces, as the house is four-sided, agreeing with the cardinal points of the compass. It contains in all some 20 acres, quite surrounded by the solid stone wall above mentioned. There are many trees on it, which make it in places gloomy, and there is a deep, dark-looking pond or small lake, evidently fed by some springs, as the water is clear and flows away in a fair-sized stream. The house is very large, and of all periods. This passage describes Carfax, a sprawling estate of about 20 acres, enclosed by a solid stone wall and marked by heavy, rusted oak and iron gates. The name Carfax likely derives from Quatre Faces, reflecting the house's four-sided structure aligned with the compass points. The property features a gloomy atmosphere due to numerous trees, a clear, spring-fed pond, and a medieval-style house with thick stone walls, barred windows, and an inaccessible old chapel, which the narrator photographs from outside. Periods back, I should say, to medieval times, for one part is of stone immensely thick, with only a few windows high up and heavily barred with iron. It looks like part of a keep, and is close to an old chapel or church. I could not enter it, as I had not the key of the door leading to it from the house, but I have taken with my Kodak views of it from various points. The house has been added to, but in a very straggling way, and I can only guess at the amount of ground it covers, which must be very great. There are but few houses close at hand, one being a very large house only recently added to and formed into a private lunatic asylum. It is not, however, visible from the grounds. When I had finished, he said, "I am glad that it is old and big. I myself am of an old family, and to live in a new house would kill me. A house cannot be made habitable in a day, and after all, how few days go to make up a century. I rejoice also that there is a chapel of old times. We Transylvanian nobles Love not to think that our bones may lie. The passage describes a large, sprawling house with extensive grounds near a recently converted private lunatic asylum that remains out of sight. The speaker expresses a deep appreciation for the house's age and size, emphasizing a personal connection to old family traditions and a disdain for new homes, valuing the historical chapel and the somber atmosphere. He reveals a melancholic disposition shaped by years of mourning and finds comfort in the castle's broken, shadowy state, which matches his own somber mood. Amongst the common dead. I seek not gaiety nor mirth, not the bright voluptuousness of much sunshine and sparkling waters which please the young and gay. I am no longer young, and my heart, through weary years of mourning over the dead, is not attuned to mirth. Moreover, the walls of my castle are broken, the shadows are many, and the wind breathes cold through the broken battlements and casements. I love the shade and the shadow, and would be alone with my thoughts when I may. Somehow his words and his look did not seem to accord, or else it was that his cast of face made his smile look malignant and saturnine. Presently, with an excuse, he left me, asking me to put all my papers together. He was some little time away, and I began to look at some of the books around me. One was an atlas, which I found opened naturally at England, as if that map had been much used. On looking at it, I found in certain places little rings marked, and on examining these, I noticed that one was near London on the east side, manifestly where in this passage, the narrator, seeking solitude, is momentarily left alone by the Count, whose unsettling smile and demeanor create a sense of unease. While waiting, the narrator examines an atlas in the room, noticing it frequently open to a map of England with marked locations near London, Exeter, and Whitby, places tied to the Count's interests or plans. After some time, the Count returns, encourages the narrator to stop working, and leads them to a prepared supper in the next room. His new estate was situated. The other two were Exeter and Whitby on the Yorkshire coast. It was the better part of an hour when the Count returned. "Aha," he said, "still at your books. Good, but you must not work always. Come, I am informed that your supper is ready." He took my arm, and we went into the next room, where I found an excellent supper ready on the table. The Count again excused himself, as he had dined out on his being away from home. But he sat as on the previous night and chatted whilst I ate. After supper I smoked as on the last evening, and the Count stayed with me, chatting and asking questions on every conceivable subject, hour after hour. I felt that it was getting very late indeed, but I did not say anything, for I felt under obligation to meet my host's wishes in every way. I was not sleepy, as the long sleep yesterday had fortified me, but I could not help experiencing that chill which comes over one at the coming of the dawn, which is like, in its way, the turn of the tide. They say that people who are near death die generally at the change to the dawn or at the turn of the tide. Anyone who has, when tired and tied as it were to his post, experienced this change in the atmosphere can well believe it. All at once we heard the crow of a cock coming up with preternatural shrillness through the clear morning air. Count Dracula, jumping to his feet, said, "Why, there is the morning again. How remiss I am to let you stay up so long. You must make your conversation regarding my dear new country of England less interesting, so that I may not forget how time flies by us." And, with a courtly bow, he quickly left me. I went into my own room and drew the curtains, but there was little to notice. My window opened into the courtyard. All I could see was the warm gray of quickening sky, so I pulled the curtains again and have written of this day. 8 May. I began to fear as I in this passage, Count Dracula abruptly ends a conversation with the narrator upon hearing a rooster crow, signaling the arrival of morning, and excuses himself with a polite bow, urging the narrator to make future discussions less captivating to avoid losing track of time. The narrator, left alone, retreats to their room, observes the courtyard through the window as the sky lightens, and then resumes writing about the day. By May 8th, the narrator reflects on their detailed journaling with growing unease about the strange atmosphere of the place and a deep desire to leave, feeling isolated with no one to confide in. Wrote in this book that I was getting too diffuse, but now I am glad that I went into detail from the first, for there is something so strange about this place and all in it that I cannot but feel uneasy. I wish I were safe out of it, or that I had never come. It may be that this strange night existence is telling on me, but would that were all. If there were anyone to talk to, I could bear it, but there is no one. I have only the Count to speak with, and I fear I am myself the only living soul within the place. Let me be prosaic so far as facts can be. It will help me to bear up, and imagination must not run riot with me. If it does, I am lost. Let me say at once how I stand, or seem to. I only slept a few hours when I went to bed, and feeling that I could not sleep any more, got up. I had hung my shaving glass by the window and was just beginning to shave. Suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard the Count's voice saying to me, "Good morning." I started, for it amazed me that I had not seen him, since the reflection of the glass covered the whole room behind me. In starting, I had cut myself slightly, but did not notice it at the moment. Having answered the Count's salutation, I turned to the glass again to see how I had been mistaken. This time there could be no error, for the man was close to me and I could see him over my shoulder, but there was no reflection of him in the mirror. The whole room behind me was displayed, but there was no sign of a man in it except myself. This was startling, and coming on the top of so many strange things was beginning to increase that vague feeling of uneasiness which I always have when the Count is near. But at the instant I saw that the cut had bled a little and the blood was trickling over my chin. I laid down the razor, turning as I did so half round to look for some sticking plaster. When the Count saw my face, his eyes blazed with a sort of demoniac fury, and he suddenly made a grab at my throat. I drew away, and his hand. In this passage, the narrator, while shaving, notices a cut on his chin and turns to find a plaster, only to see no reflection of the Count in the mirror despite feeling his presence. The Count, upon seeing the narrator's face, reacts with intense fury and lunges at his throat. But his aggression instantly subsides when his hand touches the crucifix necklace the narrator wears, warning the narrator to be cautious of cuts in this dangerous country. The Count then angrily seizes and discards the shaving mirror, condemning it as a symbol of human vanity. Touched the string of beads which held the crucifix. It made an instant change in him, for the fury passed so quickly that I could hardly believe that it was ever there. "Take care," he said. "Take care how you cut yourself. It is more dangerous than you think in this country." Then seizing the shaving glass, he went on, "And this is the wretched thing that has done the mischief. It is a foul bauble of man's vanity. Away with it." And opening the heavy window with one wrench of his terrible hand, he flung out the glass, which was shattered into 1,000 pieces on the stones of the courtyard far below. Then he withdrew without a word. It is very annoying, for I do not see how I am to shave, unless in my watch case or the bottom of the shaving pot, which is fortunately of metal. When I went into the dining room, breakfast was prepared, but I could not find the Count anywhere, so I breakfasted alone. It is strange that as yet I have not seen the Count eat or drink. He must be a very peculiar man. After breakfast, I did a little exploring in the castle. I went out on the stairs and found a room looking. In this passage, the narrator describes a disturbing incident where the Count forcefully breaks a window, shattering the glass onto the courtyard below, before leaving without explanation, leaving the narrator puzzled about how to shave without a mirror. The narrator then has breakfast alone, noting the Count's peculiar absence and lack of eating or drinking, and afterward explores the castle, discovering a room with a breathtaking southern view. From this vantage point, the castle's perilous location on the edge of a steep precipice is revealed, surrounded by an expansive forest with deep chasms visible in the distance. Towards the south, the view was magnificent, and from where I stood, there was every opportunity of seeing it. The castle is on the very edge of a terrible precipice. A stone falling from the window would fall 1,000 feet without touching anything. As far as the eye can reach is a sea of green treetops, with occasionally a deep rift where there is a chasm. Here and there are silver threads where the rivers wind in deep gorges through the forests. But I am not in heart to describe beauty, for when I had seen the view, I explored further. Doors, doors, doors everywhere, and all locked and bolted. In no place, save from the windows in the castle walls, is there an available exit. The castle is a veritable prison, and I am a prisoner. Chapter 3. Jonathan Harker's journal continued. When I found that I was a prisoner, a sort of wild feeling came over me. I rushed up and down the stairs, trying every door and in this passage from Jonathan Harker's journal in Dracula, Harker describes his growing realization that he is trapped within a castle, surrounded by locked doors and bolted exits, with no way out except through the windows in the castle walls. Overwhelmed by a sense of wild desperation, he frantically searches for an escape, rushing through the castle and testing every door and window, only to be consumed by helplessness. Eventually, accepting his imprisonment, he calms himself and begins to rationally consider his next steps. Peering out of every window I could find, but after a little, the conviction of my helplessness overpowered all other feelings. When I look back after a few hours, I think I must have been mad for the time, for I behaved much as a rat does in a trap. When, however, the conviction had come to me that I was helpless, I sat down quietly as I have ever done anything in my life, and began to think over what was best to be done. I am thinking still, and as yet have come to no definite conclusion. Of one thing only am I certain, that it is no use making my ideas known to the Count. He knows well that I am imprisoned, and as he has done it himself, and has doubtless his own motives for it, he would only deceive me if I trusted him fully with the facts. So far as I can see, my only plan will be to keep my knowledge and my fears to myself, and my eyes open. I am, I know, either being deceived, like a baby, by my own fears, or else I am in desperate straits, and if the latter be so, I need, and shall need, all my brains to get through. I had hardly come to this conclusion when I heard the great door below shut, and knew that the Count had returned. He did not come at once into the library, so I went cautiously to my own room and found him making the bed. This was odd, but only confirmed what I had all along thought, that there were no servants in the house. When later I saw him through the chink of the hinges of the door laying the table in the dining room, I was assured of it. For if he does himself all these menial offices, surely it is proof that there is no one else to do them. This gave me a fright, for if there is no one else in the castle, it must have been the Count himself who was the driver of the coach that brought me here. This is a terrible thought, for if so, what does it mean that he could control the wolves, as he did, by only holding up his hand in silence? How was it that all the In this passage, the narrator observes the Count performing menial tasks like setting the table, leading to the realization that there is no other staff in the castle. This discovery alarms the narrator, as it implies that the Count himself drove the coach that brought them there and seemingly controlled wolves with a mere gesture. The narrator also reflects on the fear shown by the people of Bistritz and the protective items they provided, finding unexpected comfort in the crucifix, given by a kind woman despite previous reservations about such symbols. People at Bistritz and on the coach had some terrible fear for me. What meant the giving of the crucifix, of the garlic, of the wild rose, of the mountain ash. Bless that good, good woman who hung the crucifix round my neck, for it is a comfort and a strength to me whenever I touch it. It is odd that a thing which I have been taught to regard with disfavor and as idolatrous should in a time of loneliness and trouble be of help. Is it that there is something in the essence of the thing itself, or that it is a medium, a tangible help in conveying memories of sympathy and comfort? Some time, if it may be, I must examine this matter and try to make up my mind about it. In the meantime, I must find out all I can about Count Dracula, as it may help me to understand. Tonight he may talk of himself if I turn the conversation that way. I must be very careful, however, not to awake his suspicion. Midnight. I have had a long talk with the Count. I asked him a few questions on Transylvania history, and he warmed up to the subject wonderfully. In his speaking of things and people, and especially of battles, he spoke as if he had. In this passage, the narrator reflects on the significance of an object as a medium for memories of sympathy and comfort, intending to explore this idea further while prioritizing the urgent task of learning about Count Dracula. During a midnight conversation, the narrator subtly steers the discussion toward Transylvanian history, prompting the Count to speak passionately about past events and battles as if he had witnessed them, attributing this personal connection to the pride and identity of a boy are tied to his lineage. The Count's use of we when referring to his house underscores a regal, collective sense of heritage that captivates the narrator. He had been present at them all. This he afterwards explained by saying that to a boyar the pride of his house and name is his own pride, that their glory is his glory, that their fate is his fate. Whenever he spoke of his house, he always said we, and spoke almost in the plural, like a king speaking. I wish I could put down all he said exactly as he said it, for to me it was most fascinating. It seemed to have in it a whole history of the country. He grew excited as he spoke, and walked about the room pulling his great white mustache and grasping anything on which he laid his hands as though he would crush it by main strength. One thing he said which I shall put down as nearly as I can, for it tells in its way the story of his race. We Shekelis have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood. In this passage, a character passionately speaks about the history and pride of his people, the Shekelis, while pacing and gripping objects with intense energy. He claims their lineage includes many brave races who fought fiercely for dominance, likening their spirit to that of lions. He describes how the Ugric tribe, infused with the warrior spirit of Thor and Woden, brought a ferocious, almost supernatural force to Europe, Asia, and Africa, striking fear into others as if they were werewolves. Blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship. Here, in the whirlpool of European races, the Ugric tribe bore down from Iceland the fighting spirit which Thor and Woden gave them, which their berserkers displayed to such fell intent on the seaboards of Europe. Aye, and of Asia and Africa too, till the peoples thought that the werewolves themselves had come. Here too, when they came, they found the Huns, whose warlike fury had swept the earth like a living flame, till the dying peoples held that in their veins ran the blood of those old witches, who, expelled from Scythia, had mated with the devils in the desert. Fools, fools! What devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins? He held up his arms. Is it a wonder that we were a conquering race, that we were proud, that when the Magyar, the Lombard, the Avar, the Bulgar, or the Turk poured his thousands on our frontiers, we drove them back? Is it strange that when Arpad and his legions swept through the Hungarian fatherland, he found us here when he reached the frontier? That the Honfoglalas was completed there? And in this passage, the speaker reflects on the fierce history of the Huns, led by the legendary Attila, whose blood he claims runs in his own veins, portraying them as a proud and conquering race. He describes how various groups like the Magyars and others were repelled by his ancestors at the Hungarian frontiers, highlighting their role in the Honfoglalas, the Hungarian conquest. The speaker also emphasizes the Szekely's kinship with the Magyars and their enduring responsibility as frontier guards against the ever-vigilant Turks, ready to defend at the king's call. When the Hungarian flood swept eastward, the Szekelyes were claimed as kindred by the victorious Magyars, and to us for centuries was trusted the guarding of the frontier of Turkeyland. Aye, and more than that, endless duty of the frontier guard, for, as the Turks say, water sleeps, and enemy is sleepless. Who more gladly than we throughout the four nations received the bloody sword, or at its warlike call flocked quicker to the standard of the king? When was redeemed that great shame of my nation, the shame of Kosovo, when the flags of the Wallach and the Magyar went down beneath the crescent? Who was it but one of my own race who as voivode crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own ground? This was a Dracula indeed. This passage reflects on the historical valor of a Dracula, a voivode from the speaker's lineage, who achieved a significant victory against the Turks by crossing the Danube and defeating them on their own territory, redeeming the shame of Kosovo. It laments the betrayal by Dracula's unworthy brother, who sold their people into slavery under Turkish rule. Additionally, it highlights a later descendant of Dracula who repeatedly led forces into Turkish lands, persisting in battle despite setbacks and returning alone from devastating losses. Woe was it that his own unworthy brother, when he had fallen, sold his people to the Turk and brought the shame of slavery on them? Was it not this Dracula, indeed, who inspired that other of his race, who in a later age again and again brought his forces over the great river into Turkey land, who, when he was beaten back, came again and again and again, though he had to come alone from the bloody field where his troops were being slaughtered, since he knew that he alone could ultimately triumph? They said that he thought only of himself. Bah, what good are peasants without a leader? Where ends the war without a brain and heart to conduct it? Again, when, after the Battle of Mohacs, we threw off the Hungarian yoke, we of the Dracula blood were amongst their leaders, for our spirit would not brook that we were not free. Ah, young sir, the Szekelyes and the Dracula, as their heart's blood, their brains, and their swords, can boast a record that mushroom growths like the Habsburgs and the Romanovs can never reach. The warlike days are over. Blood is too precious a thing in these days of dishonorable peace, and the glories of the great races are as a tale that is told. It was by this time In this passage, a character, presumably of the Dracula lineage, passionately defends the importance of leadership and the historical valor of the Sekules and the Dracula family, asserting their crucial role in past battles like Mohacs against oppressive rule. They lament the end of warlike days and the loss of glory in a time of dishonorable peace, comparing their storied past to mere tales. The narrative then shifts as the speaker notes the late hour, retires to bed, and resolves in a diary entry dated May 12th to focus on verifiable facts rather than personal observations or memories. On morning and we went to bed. Mem. This diary seems horribly like the beginning of the Arabian Nights, for everything has to break off at cockcrow, or like the ghost of Hamlet's father. 12th May. Let me begin with facts, bare, meager facts, verified by books and figures, and of which there can be no doubt. I must not confuse them with experiences which will have to rest on my own observation or my memory of them. Last evening, when the Count came from his room, he began by asking me questions on legal matters and on the doing of certain kinds of business. I had spent the day wearily over books, and simply to keep my mind occupied, went over some of the matters I had been examining. In this passage, the Count emerges from his room and engages the narrator in a discussion about legal matters and business practices in England. The narrator, having spent a tiring day studying at Lincoln's Inn, answers the Count's methodical questions, starting with whether a man in England can have multiple solicitors. The narrator explains that while a man may employ several solicitors, it is unwise to have more than one handle a single transaction, as it could harm his interests. At Lincoln's Inn, there was a certain method in the Count's inquiries, so I shall try to put them down in sequence. The knowledge may somehow or sometime be useful to me. First, he asked if a man in England might have 2 solicitors or more. I told him he might have a dozen if he wished, but that it would not be wise to have more than one solicitor engaged in one transaction, as only one could act at a time, and that to change would be certain to militate against his interest. He seemed thoroughly to understand, and went on to ask if there would be any practical difficulty in having one man to attend, say, to banking, and another to look after shipping, in case local help were needed in a place far from the home of the banking solicitor. I asked him. Last evening, the Count emerged from his room and engaged in a detailed discussion with the narrator about legal matters and business transactions in England. The narrator, having spent the day studying legal texts at Lincoln's Inn, answered the Count's methodical questions, including whether a man could employ multiple solicitors. The narrator advised that while possible, it's impractical to have more than one solicitor per transaction to avoid conflicts. The Count then inquired about the feasibility of having different solicitors handle separate aspects like banking and shipping, especially in distant locations, and began to explain his situation involving a property purchase in London through a mutual acquaintance, Mr. Peter Hawkins, base far from the city in Exeter. That was Dracula, Part 1 by Bram Stoker. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this.